There are stories in the Imperium that begin with thunder and screaming starships, with bolter fire and banners raised high and the clarion call of war. But this story begins with quiet. A quiet so deep, so ancient that even the scholars of the Adeptus Administratum, buried beneath miles of parchment and dust, could not say when it first crept into the galaxy. Before the first Tyrannic War, before even a name existed for the devouring swarms, there was only a feeling, a pressure, a shadow only whispered about in meditation chambers and astropathic crypts. Most would never notice it. Most would go about their lives beneath the Imperium's watchful, distant gaze. Farmers tilling fields on rural agri-worlds under twin suns, tired manufacturum workers breathing recycled air on hive planets older than memory. Astartes training in fortress monasteries, the echo of bolter drills ringing off ceramite walls. Imperial Navy crews standing watch on endless patrols, drifting through star-flecked black. To them, the galaxy was already full of orcs and heretics, demons and traitors, the Xenos and the nameless. There was always something to fear, always a threat looming at the edge of the void. And yet, this presence was different. It did not roar. It did not blaze. It did not announce itself like the green tides of the orcs or the burning warp storms of chaos. It simply waited, lingering beyond thought, beyond signal relay and charted stars, beyond even the psyker-born whispers that all Imperial souls must endure in their lifetime. Like the moment before a heartbeat, like the hush before a door creaks open. The Imperium did not expect the Tyranids because it did not know how to imagine them. Across the eastern fringe, where the stars grow thin and the Emperor's light stretches faint, Imperial explorers had long charted stray anomalies and unexplained silences. Lost colonies, vanishing ships. Planets that had once burned brightly in the Administratum's archives, now marked simply with a single word: silenced, not conquered, not corrupted, not heretical, just gone. In those remote, lonely regions of the galaxy, records faded like dying embers. Administratum scribes shrugged. Naval subcommanders reassigned patrol routes. Ecclesiarchy preachers claimed local superstition. And on those empty borders, space lay still. It was not unusual, they said, for the void to take its tithe. Sometimes ships disappeared, sometimes worlds died. It was simply the way of things. Better not to think about it too closely. Better to remain secure in the fortress walls of belief. For the galaxy was vast, and the Imperium, mighty as it was, could not look everywhere at once. Far above those frontier stars floated the quiet bastions of the Death Watch, black-armored sentinels, solemn and few, who peered constantly into the night from adamantium-walled observatories. They stood like monks in midnight prayer, surrounded by drifting motes of incense and glowing runes of threat-indexing cogitators. There, secluded from the roar of battlefields and the noise of Imperial politics, the watch captains listened. Not to comm traffic, not to astropathic streams, but to absence. There are sounds one expects in the immensity of space, background warp resonance. The dim hum of the Astronomican's psychic pulse, the restless chatter of the void, but in certain sectors there was less. A thinning, the way air becomes still before a storm, the way a forest falls silent when a predator steps between the trees. Deathwatch lorekeepers pondered this quiet, marking patterns in secrecy. Not yet alarmed, but uneasy. Uncertain where the signs pointed, but unable to ignore them. Every silence in the galaxy has a shape, and this one felt like something waiting to consume. In the far-flung craft worlds where ancient souls drift within infinity circuits and seers walk paths of starlight, whispers stirred too. The Eldar felt the tremor long before men with quills or power armor even suspected such a thing existed. Their runes spoke of hunger, their bones tingled with dread. and their farcers, draped in shimmering robes, saw something in the skeins of fate, a shadow that was not of the warp, a predator without malice, without rage, without sin, not evil, merely inevitable. Some believed it was another rise of chaos, others feared a new Necron awakening. But those who listened closely, who opened themselves to patterns older than human empires and younger than dying stars, saw it clear as ghostlight, not a rival, not a conqueror, a consumer, one that did not want territory or rulership, only biomass, only fuel, life turned to nourishment, worlds stripped to bone and dust. They sent warnings in the ways they could, in riddles to outcast rangers, in half-spoken fragments to reluctant human diplomats, in spectral dreams that psychers glimpsed during their most fevered scrying. Most were ignored. After all, humans rarely heed the Eldar. They listen only when the blade is already at their throat. Somewhere deep within the labyrinth vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, far beneath the clang of forges and the roar of plasma engines, a handful of tech seers pondered strange organic traces found clinging to hulls of ghost ships recovered at the fringe. Cells unlike any catalogued species. Organisms that dissolved into nothing when studied too closely, as if they resisted definition. A few whispered the same word, though quietly, as though afraid it might answer if spoken too loudly. Tyranids. A name that came from beyond Imperial borders, brought by a scattering of void nomads and half-mad explorers. A name that felt alien even to their augmetic tongues. But the Mechanicus, vast and divided as it was, did not move in unity. Some magi believed, some doubted. Some demanded empirical proof no expedition could yet return safely with, and some, distracted by their own obsessions, filed the reports and forgot them. For the Imperium is not a single mind, but a billion tired ones stacked across millennia. And so the warnings drifted like dust, not dismissed, just lost in the endless tide of everything else. The Imperium has always been a place where catastrophe does not come from ignorance, but from overwhelming noise. When everything is a crisis, nothing is. Meanwhile, in lonely astropathic choir vaults on far-flung worlds, psychers felt something strange. They described it in different ways depending on vocabulary and fear. A dimming, a hush, a pressure against the inside of the skull, like trying to breathe in a room where the air has been quietly stolen. It was not the raw pain of chaos, not the shriek of demonic intrusion, not the twisting psychic poison of Xeno's sorcery. It was emptiness. A silence in the warp that felt unnatural precisely because it lacked violence. Imagine a candle flame flickering, then dimming, not because the wind blows against it, but because the very air around it becomes thin. Some choir masters reported the phenomenon to Sector Command. Others assumed it was fatigue, and more than a few astropaths simply died quietly, burned out by the strain, leaving only a note in a duty log. Signal weakening. Something beyond the stars. Cannot hear. Cannot breathe. The dark is hungry. No one understood what they meant, not yet. To the common citizen of the Imperium, none of this mattered. The galaxy was impossibly large. Danger was a daily companion. Tales of lost worlds and devourers in the dark were simply one rumor among thousands. And when you live in hive slums where the air tastes of rust, or on ash wastes where sandstorms strip skin from bone, a hypothetical terror far beyond charted space feels distant. It is difficult to fear monsters you cannot imagine when you already fear starvation, mutation, conscription, and the knock of Imperial authorities on your door. Most people lived and worked and prayed and died without ever knowing that a shadow had already begun to unfurl beyond the reach of their sun. They did not know that across the void, biological tendrils drifted like pollen in cosmic winds. They did not know that worlds were already being stripped clean, ecosystems uprooted, oceans drained, mountains hollowed out like eggshells. They did not know that something was tasting the edges of their reality, learning, evolving, preparing. They only felt perhaps in dreams, a sense of being watched, a predator's patience settling like dust. There is a rhythm to the galaxy. Worlds rise, empires fall. War comes and goes like tides. Even the warp breathes, violent, unpredictable yet cyclical. But the Tyranids do not fit this rhythm. They are not a tide, ebbing and flowing. They are a wave that always rises. Long before Behemoth arrived at the northern fringe of the Imperium, before Macragge's skies darkened and the Ultramarines stood against the oncoming storm, the seeds of invasion were already planted. Tendrils drifting silently through intergalactic void. Bioships larger than cities drifting like slow leviathans, dormant spores waiting for optimal vectors. A fleet intelligence dreaming, not sleeping, not alive in human terms, but aware in a way that defies human language. Waiting until the time was right, waiting until the galaxy was ready to be eaten. Some Imperial historians looking back centuries later would describe this period as a strategic lull, a pause between great eras of conflict, a chance for reconstruction, fortification, and vigilance. But that perspective only came after. At the time, no one believed they were standing on a precipice. No one saw the horizon changing. No one felt the breath before the scream. The danger of peace is not complacency. It is unawareness. Storms do not warn you. Predators do not roar before they pounce. Across the eastern fringe, the stars glimmered in their ancient glow. Trade routes flickered with steady traffic. Astropathic signals drifted through the void, faint but functional. And even among those who sensed the coming dark, none could conceive of the scale. For all its might, all its armies, all its dreadnoughts and fortress worlds and night houses and fleets, the Imperium was built to fight enemies it understood: heretics, demons, orcs, traitors, Eldar raiders, Tau expansions, Necron stirrings in forgotten tombs. But how do you prepare for a threat that does not negotiate, does not bargain, does not hate, and does not stop? How do you plan for a foe that grows stronger each time you resist it? How do you defend a galaxy from hunger, piece by piece? Quiet as frost forming on a window pane, slow as roots creeping through soil beneath a sleeper's bed. Astropaths felt their signals strain. Rogue traders charted empty systems with no survivors. The Death Watch's augur banks saw subtle anomalies. Eldar runes shimmered ominously. Mechanicus data crypts ticked with unconfirmed biological curiosities. And still humanity slept in the dark. The great threat to all life did not arrive with fire. It arrived with silence. Soon, very soon, that silence would break. Soon void ships would arrive trailing bioplasma and chitinous hulls. Soon worlds would scream as the sky itself became a mouth. Soon the Imperium would learn that the galaxy had never belonged to them. They had simply been allowed to live in it. Until the true appetite awoke, until the Great Devourer reached out at last to feed. It began as such things often do in the galaxy without warning. One moment the void was calm, a black sea glittering with distant suns. And the next, the stars themselves seemed to dim. For those who lived and died under the rule of the Imperium, the name Behemoth would become a curse whispered through the centuries. But in those first quiet days of discovery, it was not a name at all, only a direction, a point on a map that had begun to go dark. In the closing years of M4 1.739, astropathic choirs across the eastern fringe began to fail. Entire transmission relays fell silent without sign of interference. No psychic storms, no warp anomalies, just absence. At first, the Adeptus Astra Telepathica assumed instrument failure. But then came the dreams. Thousands of astropaths screaming from sleep with the same image burned into their minds. A sky boiling with wings, 1,000 eyes opening at once. And beneath it all, A voice that was not a voice whispering through the dark. All will be eaten. No message was clearer, and yet none were understood. At the same time, void ships patrolling the borders of Segmentum Ultima reported fleeting contacts, shadows larger than battleships drifting between systems. No energy signature, no communication, no metallic hull. When the first of these vessels was destroyed by the fleet of Admiral Cethon, it did not explode, and it burst, spraying organic debris and corrosive ichor into the void. It was then the Imperium realized they were not ships, they were alive. The creature, the fleet, the thing that humanity would name Behemoth, came from below the galactic plane, rising out of intergalactic darkness like a vast, hungry tide. Its bioships, each the size of cities, drifted in perfect, silent formation, guided by a single unfathomable will. From afar, Augur Sweep saw beauty in their symmetry. From near, horror. Each vessel was a cathedral of flesh, armored carapace gleaming with chitinous sheen, tendrils twitching in unseen currents, void organisms pulsing with unholy life. Swarms of smaller creatures clustered around them like shoals of living torpedoes, each one a weapon and a being at once. The Tyranids did not waste energy on engines or reactors. They were the engines. They were the weapons. They were the fleet. Every part of Behemoth was alive, from the smallest spore mine to the largest hive ship. Every piece obeyed the same will. Every movement served a single purpose: to feed. The first Imperial world to fall was the small agri-colony of Tyran, the place whose name would be forever etched into history as the root of Tyranids. When contact was lost, an investigation vessel, the Magos explorator Hydra Cordatus, made translation into orbit 3 weeks later. What they found was not war. There were no craters, no ruins, no wreckage. The planet itself was gone, reduced to a cracked shell. Oceans evaporated, atmosphere gone, every trace of life stripped away right down to bacterial residue. Only the skeleton of the world remained. In the official logs of the Mechanicus, the incident was recorded coldly. Complete biomatter extraction event, non-natural, pattern unclassified. But to those who saw it with their own eyes, there were no words. A world had been eaten. The warning was sent to the nearest Ultramar Defense Command, and from that moment onward, the Imperium began to understand. Something vast was moving toward them. As Behemoth advanced, psychic communications failed one by one. Astropaths went blind or mad. Even the Astronomican's beacon, the Emperor's divine psychic light, seemed to flicker at the edges of perception. Scholars and inquisitors coined a new term for it: the shadow in the warp. It was not energy. It was not a weapon. It was presence, the combined psychic mass of 1 trillion alien minds pressing against the warp like an ocean of thought. Within its reach, psychers found their powers smothered, their prayers unanswered. Even demons withdrew as though unwilling to be near it. To fight the Tyranids was to fight something that blotted out the soul itself. As the swarm approached, it left behind a trail of devastation stretching from the rimward systems of the eastern fringe toward the shining empire of Ultramar, the domain of the Ultramarines chapter. Planet after planet fell in eerie silence. Vox relays went dead. PDF regiments vanished mid-transmission. Orbital pict captures showed seas boiling, forests liquefying, mountains collapsing as something vast burrowed beneath them. And always afterward nothing remained. Each conquered world became fuel for the next. Each devoured species became a blueprint for a new bioform. Each battle made the swarm smarter, stronger, hungrier. By the time Imperial Command understood that the fleet was not a fleet but a single organism, a living, self-evolving system, Behemoth had already reached the outskirts of Ultramar. On Macragge, Fortress World and heart of Ultramar, alarms sounded for the first time in centuries. The chapter master, Marneus Calgar, recalled every strike force, every reserve company, every scout and veteran. The Ultramarines, paragons of order and doctrine, prepared for a war unlike any they had faced since the Horus Heresy. But even their precision could not prepare them for this. Calgar's first concern was containment. If Behemoth reached the dense cluster of civilized worlds in Ultramar, the loss would cascade. Entire sectors could vanish before reinforcement could arrive. So the Ultramarines established a perimeter, orbital pickets, defense stations, fleet interdiction points, and then they waited. The Tyranids did not wait long. Prandium was one of Ultramar's most beautiful worlds, a garden planet of marble cities and golden fields. It was the pride of the chapter, the living embodiment of the ideal that mankind could still create beauty in the grim darkness of the far future. When Behemoth's vanguard descended, that beauty was the first to die. Witnesses, few though they were, described the sky darkening as mycetic spores fell like endless rain. Each impact birthed new horrors, gaunts with talons sharp as swords, monstrous creatures that tore through fortifications as if they were paper. Within hours, the planetary defense forces were overwhelmed. Within days, the hives were consumed. Within a week, there was nothing left to defend. When the Ultramarines' third company made planetfall to evacuate survivors, they found none. Prandium was gone. Calgar ordered exterminatus. The surface burned, and yet the swarm kept coming. The final stand came at Macragge itself, fortress world, training bastion, and jewel of Ultramar. The Ultramarines knew this battle would decide more than their home. If Macragge fell, the entire segmentum ultima could collapse, so they fortified. Every pass, every mountain tunnel, every polar bastion carved into the ice. Civilians were evacuated, orbital stations manned by volunteers. The chapter's fleet formed a screen across the system, commanded personally by Calgar. And then, the darkness came. Hive Fleet Behemoth entered the Macragge system like a living hurricane, millions of bioships pouring through the void, blotting out the stars. The first orbital engagements were apocalyptic. Macro cannon fire lit the blackness. Bioplasma rained like meteor storms. Tyrannid living torpedoes hurled themselves into the hulls of Imperial vessels, dissolving metal and flesh alike. One by one, the defense ships died. But the Ultramarines fought with disciplined fury, targeting synapse creatures, burning entire swarms to ash before they reached atmosphere. Still, they could not stop them all. Behemoth's landing spores fell across the planet like an ocean breaking on rock. The battle for Macragge had begun. The northern and southern polar fortresses of Macragge were the linchpins of the planet's defense. Ancient bastions built deep into the ice, housing the chapter's relics, forges, and gene seed vaults. As orbital command collapsed, the Ultramarines' first company, the veterans of countless wars, were stationed there. Their orders were simple: hold until death. What followed was one of the most brutal sieges in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. Wave after wave of Tyranids hurled themselves against adamantium walls, claws scraping, acid spitting, bodies piling high. The Ultramarines fought in total darkness, surrounded by the sounds of chitin and screams. Bolters thundered, flamers roared. Power fists smashed through alien skulls. Each breach was sealed with fire and bodies, each corridor defended until every warrior within was spent. When reinforcements finally arrived weeks later, they found only silence. Frozen corridors filled with the dead, walls caked in ichor and blood. The first company had been annihilated, but they had held. The gene seed of the chapter was safe, and that, in the cold calculus of the Imperium, was victory. In orbit, Marneus Calgar gathered what remained of his fleet for a final assault. The Tyrannid hive ships were vast, grotesque silhouettes, pulsing, regenerating, seemingly endless. But the Ultramarines had learned. They had mapped the beast's patterns. identified weak points in their bioplasma arrays. Calgar's ships attacked in coordinated waves, using nova cannon blasts and concentrated torpedo fire to break apart synapse nodes. For the first time, the swarm faltered. Without central coordination, the smaller organisms became disordered, still deadly but chaotic. Calgar pressed the advantage. One by one, the massive bioships detonated under Imperial fire, and then slowly the shadow began to lift. The hive mind withdrew. The surviving Tyrannid vessels turned away from the system, retreating into the void from which they had come. The war was over. The price was unimaginable. 2/3 of the Ultramarines chapter lay dead. Entire worlds, Tyran, Prandium, Kalth's outer moons, were gone. Macragge's southern fortress was nothing but ruins and frost. But humanity had survived. For the first time, the Imperium had looked into the eyes of the Great Devourer and endured. In the years that followed, Imperial savants dissected captured biospecimens. Mechanicus Magi built new doctrines. The Inquisition classified the Tyranids as extremist-level Xenos threat. And somewhere deep within the Deathwatch archives, a simple report was filed. The Great Devourer has tasted the galaxy. It will return. After Behemoth's retreat, there was no celebration, only silence. The dead were interred in frozen halls. Ships drifted in orbit, broken and blackened. The void, once full of battle, was now empty again. And for a moment, only a moment, humanity believed it had survived the worst. They did not yet understand that what they had faced was merely a fragment of the whole, a single arm of a vast unseen organism stretching across intergalactic space. Behemoth was only the first mouth, the first taste, the first swallow. And deep beyond the stars, the Great Devourer stirred. Its hunger was endless, its memory eternal, and what it had learned at Macragge would feed the next swarm to come. When the guns finally fell silent over Macragge, the void was still choked with drifting remains. Pieces of bioships slowly freezing, fragments of Imperial hull plating turning in the light of a distant sun. The war was over, but in truth, it had only just begun. For the Imperium of man, victory had never been so hollow. The Ultramarines had endured, yes. The swarm had been repelled. But across the Administratum's vast data looms, the numbers told a darker story. Hundreds of billions dead, dozens of systems consumed, and a foe that had not been defeated, only delayed. The galaxy exhaled, but it did not rest. In the months that followed the First Tyrannic War, Imperial channels were flooded with conflicting reports. Some claimed the swarm was annihilated. Others warned of splinter tendrils still lurking in the void. Many worlds demanded reassurance. Few received it. Macragge itself became a shrine of sorts, a wound that would never close. Servitors and labor crews worked day and night to rebuild the fortresses, scraping Tyrannid ichor from the frozen walls and purging every chamber with sacred promethium. The Ultramarines interred their dead beneath the ice, each sarcophagus etched with the sigil of their company and the mark of honor. He held until the last. The survivors did not speak much of what they had seen. Some wounds were too deep for words. For every Astartes who had faced the swarm, there was the same quiet understanding. That this enemy had no weakness of faith, no desire, no pride. It could not be reasoned with, nor cowed by glory. It did not fear. It simply was. And that made it unlike any foe the Imperium had ever known. When something threatens mankind itself, the Inquisition inevitably comes to watch. From the shadows of Segmentum Ultima, agents of the Ordo Xenos converged upon Macragge. Their robes were black, their eyes colder than the void. Among them was Inquisitor Cryptman, a name that would later become legend and curse among Imperial strategists. Cryptman saw what others refused to, that Behemoth had not died. It had retreated, and a retreat in his mind was not mercy. It was learning. While administratum clerks marked the conflict as concluded, Krippmann ordered biological samples seized, autopsies performed, and psychic dissections carried out on what fragments could be salvaged. He wanted to know what the Imperium had truly faced. What he found chilled even him. The Tyrannid organisms, once isolated, began to decay rapidly. Cells collapsed into sludge when separated from one another, as though aware that unity had been broken. Every structure, every weapon, every creature, from the smallest gaunt to the towering carnifex, had been designed for purpose. No redundancy, no ego, no individuality. A perfect ecosystem of killing. Each bioform existed because the hive mind had deemed it efficient, and when inefficiency was found, it was consumed and reabsorbed. Krippmann's notes would later read, "These creatures are not alive in the way we understand. They are expressions of will, the instruments of a mind vast beyond comprehension. To study them is to study hunger itself." Across the forges and biolabs of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the work of dissection and categorization began. Magos biologists, the machine priests who devoted themselves to living systems, treated the Tyrannid remains like sacred relics. And for good reason. Every discovery defied logic. Tyrannid tissue could metabolize any form of biomass. Bone and muscle were fused into structures stronger than ceramite, yet light enough to fly. Neural pathways shimmered with electrochemical complexity rivaling the Mechanicus' own noosphere networks. Even after death, the samples moved, twitching, attempting to knit themselves back together. Some even sprouted feeder tendrils as if searching for sustenance that wasn't there. One Magos, known only as biologist Varn, wrote, "We are accustomed to machines that obey. The Tyranids are machines that think, that adapt, that dream. I begin to suspect they are not created things at all under Ultramar. They are creators. The Mechanicus burned his body after his final experiment consumed an entire laboratory." No further comment was logged. As the data spread through Imperial command, a new understanding took root. A grim clinical realization that the Tyranids could never be fought the same way twice. Every battle changed them. Every weapon used against them became a lesson they would absorb. If flamers proved effective, new carapaces evolved to resist heat. If explosive ordnance shredded their lines, next time they grew thicker, bone-like shields. If psychers struck them down, they produced synapse creatures to nullify the warp. The Tyranids did not lose. They learned. This doctrine became gospel within the Ordo Xenos and the Death Watch. It was known simply as the law of consumption. What the Tyrannid eats, it becomes. What it becomes, it perfects. What it perfects, it unleashes again. In the cold voids of Watch Fortress Ariok and its distant kin, the Death Watch gathered. They were Astartes drawn from every chapter, united by one purpose: to know and destroy the Xenos. Where most of the Imperium saw only horror, the Death Watch saw patterns. They began cataloging every Tyrannid encountered, assigning them designations and behavioral profiles. Hormigaunt, fast feral shock troops. Termagant, range support with living ammunition. Warrior, synapse creatures capable of command. Carnifex, living tanks. Lictor, hunters and assassins. Zoanthrope, psychic artillery forms. For each, countermeasures were developed, specialized ammunition. Bolter variants tuned to acidic tissue, melta charges adapted to breach biochitin. But every new weapon came with a quiet unease. Each innovation would be seen again. Mirrored, improved, reflected in the swarm. The Tyranids were watching too. Beyond the military, entire research divisions sprang up to study the Great Devourer's biology. On Mars, Mechanicus Magi attempted to grow Tyrannid tissue in stasis. On Terra, the High Lords debated containment strategies. On distant Forge worlds, experimental gene splicing projects began, sanctioned and unsanctioned alike. And always, somewhere, something went wrong. Lab-grown samples multiplied unexpectedly. Containment failed. Bioforms reactivated after incineration. Each incident was purged and erased from record, but the whispers spread. The Tyranids could not truly be destroyed. They were part of the galaxy now. Wherever they had passed, spores remained dormant, waiting perhaps for the right conditions to bloom again. One of the greatest mysteries of Behemoth was not its flesh, but its mind. Astropaths across Ultramar reported a lingering silence in the warp long after the swarm's retreat. It was as if the very fabric of the immaterium had been scarred. Ships traveling through affected regions found navigation erratic. Astropathic messages arrived garbled, delayed, or not at all. Even dreams were different there. Dreamless, colorless, flat. To most citizens, it was just another horror to fear. To psychers, it was worse, a taste of something that felt like suffocation. The Scholastica Psychana began studying the effect and confirmed the impossible. The shadow in the warp was still there, faint but persistent. Behemoth had withdrawn, yes, but its echo remained like the scent of ozone after lightning. And to those sensitive enough to hear it, it whispered of things yet to come. On the orders of the Segmentum Command, a new military codex was written, the Tyrannic War Doctrine. It established a framework for planetary defense and fleet engagement against Hive fleets. Its key principles were simple, yet sobering: concentration of force. Do not divide fleets. The Tyrannid's strength is in numbers. Scattered Imperial formations are swallowed whole. Planetary evacuation, civilian extraction takes precedence over resistance once a Hive fleet is in system. No world is worth feeding the enemy. Target the synapse, kill the mind, and the swarm falters. Never assume victory. If a fleet retreats, it is learning. These tenets were taught in every naval academy, every guard command school, every Astartes fortress monastery. The Imperium had faced countless horrors before, but this enemy demanded something different. Understanding. The Tyranids were not an opponent. They were a phenomenon, and phenomena cannot be conquered, only endured. While others wrote manuals and counted casualties, Inquisitor Cryptman did not rest. He continued to trace faint psychic disturbances at the edges of the eastern fringe, mapping void patterns that no sane mind would see as connected. Each disturbance pulsed faintly, like the beating of a distant heart. When plotted together, they formed a shape, a slow, encircling pattern. The remnants of Behemoth were not drifting randomly. They were reforming, growing, spreading along new vectors. Cryptman's reports were met with bureaucratic resistance. Many high officials believed the Inquisitor's warnings were exaggerated. Surely the Imperium's strength had broken the swarm for good. He was reassigned, censured, silenced. But Cryptman continued his work in secret, whispering to any who would listen. The Great Devourer does not die. It sleeps between meals, and it is always hungry. Even as humanity studied its enemy, the enemy studied humanity. Far beyond the galactic rim, the hive mind processed what Behemoth had learned. The patterns of ultramarine defense, the taste of human gene stock, the resistance of Astartes tissue. Every adaptation, every fragment of data was absorbed into the collective. The Tyranids did not mourn their losses, they used them. From Behemoth's death came evolution. From that evolution would come the next fleet. More cunning, more efficient, more silent. The Great Devourer was patient. It did not measure time as mortals did. It simply expanded, spreading tendrils into the black between galaxies, feeling for weakness. And as it did, the void itself seemed to lean closer, listening. For nearly a century after Behemoth's retreat, the Imperium knew a fragile peace. Worlds were rebuilt, trade resumed. The name Tyrannid faded from common speech, remembered only by soldiers and scholars. Children were born who had never heard of Macragge. Statues of Ultramar's fallen gleamed under clean skies. Even the Inquisition's tone softened, relegating the Tyranids to a remote concern. But those who had fought them, the veterans of the polar fortresses, the fleet officers who saw the living ships firsthand, never felt peace. They spoke of a sensation that never left them, a taste of static at the edge of hearing, the feeling that something vast and cold still watched from beyond the stars. They were right. In the cold darkness between galaxies, the hive mind of the Tyranids digested everything it had learned. It remembered the metallic tang of human worlds, the disciplined response of the Ultramarines, the destructive power of orbital fire, and it adapted. Where Behemoth had been a blunt hammer, the next swarm would be many hands. Splintering, spreading, striking from a dozen directions at once, the Great Devourer had learned the taste of resistance. Now it would learn how to break it. On Macragge, beneath layers of frost and time, the tombs of the First Company stood silent, their names carved into stone, their deeds recited in chapter rituals that would echo for 10,000 years. And above them, in the rebuilt fortress, the Ultramarines continued their vigil. Every warrior who trained there walked beneath banners stained with the memory of Behemoth. Every recruit learned the lesson of their forebears. The galaxy is not ours to rule. It is ours to defend against the hunger that waits between the stars. Some nights when the void was quiet and the wind howled across the polar ice, the sentries swore they could still hear it. A faint hum, like distant wings, just beyond the horizon of sound. And they wondered if the Great Devourer dreamed of them too. It began almost 100 years after the fall of Behemoth, a century of uneasy quiet, a century in which humanity dared to believe that perhaps the worst was behind them, a century in which the name Tyrannid became a cautionary footnote, a lesson in vigilance, not an omen of apocalypse. But the void does not forget, and hunger does not fade. Beyond the rim, the Great Devourer stirred again, and this time it came not as a single monstrous tide, but as 1,000 streams flowing through the dark, separate, yet united. A new hive fleet, vast beyond reckoning. It would be called Kraken, where Behemoth had been a battering ram, a brute force of flesh and chitin. Kraken was something far more insidious. Instead of one great advance, it splintered itself into countless tendrils, each moving independently yet guided by the same will. They spread across the eastern fringe like cracks spreading across glass, each arm of the fleet probing, tasting, and devouring. Kraken did not seek glory in head-on confrontation. It slipped between defenses, it struck from the shadows. It enveloped its prey from a dozen directions at once, cutting off retreat before the victim even realized it was trapped. Imperial admirals who studied its movements compared it to a living ocean current. Silent, patient, unstoppable. Wherever it touched, life simply vanished. The first signs came as they always did. Silence. Frontier outposts stopped transmitting. Mining colonies vanished. Astropathic choirs went dark. But this time, the disappearances were not along a single front. They came from dozens of distant systems all at once, too far apart to be coincidence, too coordinated to be random. Inquisitor Kryptman, now older and grayer, saw the pattern. He traced the vanishing worlds on his star maps and watched the shapes emerge, long curling arcs reaching toward the galactic heart. It was not one fleet. It was many. Each tendril of Kraken moved with terrifying intelligence, feinting, retreating, encircling, consuming. A living organism the size of a sector. And still no one believed him. After Behemoth, the Imperium had grown complacent. To the High Lords of Terra, the eastern fringe was distant and unprofitable. When Kryptman sounded the alarm, his warnings were met with weary dismissal. Another Xenos incursion, they said. Segmentum Command will handle it, but Segmentum Command would never handle it. because by the time they even saw it, it would already be too late. Far from human space, the craft world Eldar watched the skein of fate unravel once more. To them, the Tyranids were not merely invaders. They were a cosmic inevitability, a living force of entropy. The Farseers saw Krakens rise as ripples of shadow in their runes. Worlds that once glowed with psychic light began to fade like stars drowning in ink. They whispered warnings through the webway. Some reached the Exodite worlds, the ancient forest planets where the Eldar lived close to nature. Others found their way to the ears of a few human agents. Deathwatch, rogue traders, and even Kryptman himself. But most went unheard. Prophecies rarely change fate when spoken into deaf ears. And so, as the Eldar wept for what they saw coming, the Imperium remained blind. Kraken struck first at a cluster of agricultural systems known collectively as the Tyrannid Reach, a cruel irony in name alone. It came from multiple vectors at once, bypassing Imperial picket lines entirely. Orbital sensors detected nothing until the skies were already full of descending spores. Within days, the planets were overrun. The Imperial Guard regiments stationed there were experienced, veterans hardened from fighting orcs and traitors. But it made no difference. They had prepared for siege warfare. The Tyranids gave them consumption. Artillery shells vanished into seething carpets of gaunts. Air wings were dragged from the sky by winged horrors. Whole regiments simply disappeared into living tides. When the last transmission came through, it was only a single voice, broken and frantic. "They're everywhere, under the ground, inside the walls. The air itself is alive." And then, static. Another world gone. Another entry in the long ledger of extinction. By the time Imperial fleets regrouped, the truth could no longer be denied. Kryptman's star maps were correct. Hive Fleet Kraken was advancing on a front thousands of light years wide, consuming systems faster than Imperial bureaucracy could even acknowledge their loss. Each tendril moved independently, yet always in harmony, feeding, retreating, splitting again. It was as if the swarm had learned to mimic the very structure of a nervous system. Each defeat only strengthened the whole. Imperial admirals described it as trying to fight smoke with a sword. Wherever they struck, the enemy simply wasn't there anymore. And when they pursued, the swarm appeared behind them. It was a kind of intelligence the Imperium could not comprehend. Fluid, adaptive, mercilessly efficient. And at its heart, somewhere deep in the void, the hive mind watched and learned. For the Deathwatch, Kraken was both curse and calling. From their fortresses, they launched kill teams into the thick of the swarm, boarding living bioships, assassinating synapse creatures, and seizing samples at unspeakable risk. Each mission was suicide. Each success bought the Imperium a few more days of understanding. Records recovered from these missions describe the interior of Hive ships as organic labyrinths, pulsating corridors of flesh, rivers of acid, and chambers filled with dormant bioforms waiting to awaken. Some Deathwatch brothers reported hearing whispers within the ships, faint echoes of thought not their own, urging them to lay down their weapons, to stop breathing, to become part of the whole. The hive mind could feel them, and in some terrible way it almost admired their resistance. Among all the worlds that faced Kraken's fury, one would become legend. Echar 4. A densely populated hive world. It had seen invasion before, by cultists, orcs, and worse, but never anything like this. When Kraken's tendrils reached the system, planetary defense forces mobilized with grim determination. This time they would not go quietly. Inquisitor Kryptman himself was there, coordinating defense alongside elements of the Ultramarines, Space Wolves, and the Scythes of the Emperor, each chapter lending its strength to hold the line. For weeks, the skies rained death. Spore pods fell like endless meteor showers. Hive cities burned as the swarm poured through the streets, but the defenders learned, just as their enemies did. They fought with precision, targeting synapse creatures and denying the swarm its cohesion. It was a battle measured in inches and blood. When victory finally came, it was not triumph, only survival. Millions were dead, the planet scarred beyond repair. But for the first time, the Imperium had halted the Great Devourer's advance. And yet, even in defeat, Kraken learned, not all chapters were so fortunate. The scythes of the Emperor, a proud successor of the Ultramarines, bore the full weight of Kraken's fury on their homeworld of Sotha. They fought with valor, they died with honor, and they were erased. When Imperial fleets finally reached the system, they found only ruins drifting in the void. No signals, no survivors. Just the faint psychic echo of the shadow in the warp, lingering like a scar. The chapter was nearly destroyed. A handful of survivors escaped aboard their strike cruiser, the Heart of Sotha, vowing to continue the fight as nomads. In the centuries that followed, they would become hunters of the swarm. Ghost warriors striking from the shadows against the Tyranids that had devoured their home. But that is another story. As Kraken spread, Inquisitor Cryptman gathered what he could. Data, tissue samples, battle reports. Every fragment mattered. He began to see a terrible pattern. The Tyranids were learning not just how to kill, but how to outthink. Some tendrils began baiting Imperial fleets, feigning weakness to lure them into ambushes. Others seeded dead worlds with dormant spores that would awaken centuries later. Kraken was not a mindless hunger anymore. It was a strategist. And every world it consumed fed that strategy. Cryptman's conclusion, recorded in his sealed archives, was grim. The Tyranids do not fight for territory. They fight for information. Each battle is not a war, but an experiment. Eventually, the combined might of the Imperium, Astartes, and even Eldar interventions began to slow Kraken's advance. Massive naval engagements near the galactic core inflicted catastrophic losses. Entire tendrils were burned from existence, but that was the hive mind's plan all along. As Kraken's main body was shattered, hundreds of splinter fleets broke away, each carrying unique genetic memory, each learning from its own battles. They scattered across the galaxy like spores on the wind, no longer one enemy, 1,000. And from that scattering would arise new threats in every direction. Some splinters burrowed deep into the galactic south, others drifted toward the halo stars. A few vanished entirely. Silent, waiting. The Second Tyrannic War was over, but its consequences would echo for millennia. When the last of Kraken's tendrils withdrew, the Imperium counted its losses. Hundreds of worlds lost. Dozens of chapters crippled or extinct, billions of souls devoured. And yet there was something worse than the numbers. The realization that victory meant nothing, because what had been destroyed was only part of the whole. The Tyranids were not gone, they had multiplied. And no one could say where the next Hive fleet would come from, or when. In the halls of the Inquisition, Cryptman's voice grew harsher, more desperate. He urged extermination campaigns against infected systems, demanded preemptive strikes against even suspected Tyrannid presence. He was called a fanatic, a zealot, a doomsayer. But deep down, he knew he was right. The galaxy had only survived Kraken by chance. And next time, chance would not be enough. When the void finally grew quiet again, it felt wrong. The silence after Kraken was not peace, it was anticipation. Psychers reported strange dreams, oceans of chitin, whispers of endless hunger. The Death Watch redoubled their vigil. And the Ultramarines rebuilt once more, their banners heavy with memory. Even the Eldar, ancient and weary, spoke of the stars themselves trembling. The galaxy knew it was only a matter of time before the next swarm rose from the dark. And far beyond, In the void between galaxies, the Great Devourer digested what Kraken had learned. The taste of Ishar 4, the defenses of humanity, the weaknesses of the Astartes, the strength of coordinated resistance, all of it became part of the hive mind. And as it dreamed, it began to shape its next evolution. Something deeper, stronger, smarter. Something that would rise from below the galactic plane itself. Those who watched the stars could already feel it. The faint, rhythmic pulse of something vast stirring in the void. The Tyranids were not gone. They had simply changed shape. And so, the galaxy waited once more. For the next shadow, for the next hunger, for the next war. And it would come. It always comes. When Hive Fleet Kraken was broken, the galaxy believed briefly that it could breathe again. For the first time in memory, there were victories to speak of. Ishar 4 had held. Macragge had endured, the swarm had been shattered. But to those who understood what the Tyranids truly were, shattered was a dangerous word. Because the Tyranids are not like men. They do not die in defeat. They divide, and from the broken corpse of Kraken, 1,000 children were born. The galaxy's maps could not keep up with what happened next. Each fragment of Kraken became a separate hunger, a fragment of the hive mind carrying within it everything the parent fleet had learned. Some were vast, devouring entire sectors. Others were no larger than a single bioship, drifting silently through the void. They did not vanish. They waited. Each splinter learned to survive on its own terms, some feeding slowly on uninhabited worlds, others turning inward, mutating in strange and terrible ways. The Imperium began naming them out of necessity, cataloging every new pattern that emerged. Gorgon, Hydra, Scylla, Charybdis, Jormungandr, Tiamat, Naga, and countless more. Each name was a warning, each one a story of extinction. To fight one hive fleet was possible, barely. The Imperium could marshal fleets, coordinate defenses, rally its might to one front. But now there were dozens, each splinter attacked in isolation, unpredictable and cunning. They did not move in unison but in harmony, like the echoes of a song sung by something too vast for mortal minds to hear. Worlds that had survived Kraken's main assault were consumed years later by small, unnoticed tendrils. Planets once considered secure became feeding grounds overnight. Entire subsectors were erased before reinforcements could even chart their loss. The Imperium was not fighting a war anymore. It was fighting a plague. And every battle lost fed the swarm anew. One of the first and most infamous of Kraken's children was Hive Fleet Gorgon. Unlike its parent, which relied on speed and multi-front strikes, Gorgon was obsessed with adaptation. Where other Tyranids evolved between wars, Gorgon evolved during them. Its bioforms could shift resistance within hours, growing new carapace structures, altering their chemical makeup, changing weapon symbiotes mid-battle. The first Imperial encounter with Gorgon was on Castabel, a heavily industrialized world in the Segmentum Tempestus. At first, the defenders held well. Laser guns burned through the first waves with satisfying efficiency. But within a day, their weapons stopped working. The Tyrannid's flesh began refracting light and heat, rendering the beams harmless. By the third day, they were immune to promethium. By the fourth, their spores resisted atmospheric cleansing. When the world finally fell, the entire planet was marked exterminatus to prevent Gorgon's further evolution. But before its death, the Hive Fleet had learned everything it needed. Those genetic patterns would reappear centuries later, in other Tyrannid strains across the galaxy. Gorgon had proven a horrifying truth. The hive mind could learn faster than humanity could adapt. If Gorgon was the mind of mutation, Hydra was the body of renewal. Reports of Hydra described something impossible, a swarm that refused to die. Destroyed bioships reformed. Killed creatures regrew within minutes. Even weapons fire that should have obliterated them seemed only to wound. When the Death Watch engaged Hydra in the Necron-ruined system of Narthium, they found a nightmare. Every gaunt they killed seemed to birth two more. The swarm consumed its dead, recycling biomass on the battlefield faster than any known organism. Brother Captain Valthor's final transmission was short, recorded moments before his Vox feed was drowned in static. They eat themselves and rise again. There is no victory here, only repetition. Hydra was not a fleet meant to conquer, it was meant to endure. And even now, scattered reports suggest that its remnants still drift through the void, a self-healing wound, forever alive, forever hungry. Some splinter fleets learned subtlety. Jormungandr, named by terrified Imperial scribes, did not fall from the sky in fire and fury. It came from below. Its bioships burrowed into the crust of planets rather than attacking from orbit. Its organisms tunneled, ambushed, and erupted from beneath fortifications that had never faced enemies from within the ground itself. On the mining world of Valador Prime, guardsmen reported the soil itself moving. Entire armored columns were swallowed whole by sinkholes that screamed as they closed. For weeks, the world's defenders fought shadows that surfaced, struck, and vanished again. When the final bastion fell, orbital auspex showed the planet's surface, deflating. The Hive fleet had eaten it from the inside out. Where Behemoth had battered, where Kraken had surrounded, Jormungandr infiltrated. Its methods would later inspire other Hive fleets, including Leviathan itself. Not all splinter fleets spread outward. One of them stayed still. In the darkness beyond Imperial reach lies a single world that glows with unnatural green light, Tiamat. Unlike other Hive fleets, Tiamat does not travel. It defends. Scouting fleets sent to approach it were destroyed before they could land. Those who escaped described titanic structures of bone and sinew rising into orbit. Hive spires grown so large they pierced the atmosphere. Some Mechanicus observers believe Tiamat is attempting to create a stable biosphere, a permanent Tyrannid world, something more than a feeding ground. Others whisper darker theories, that the hive mind is building a synaptic node, a living relay that could amplify its will across galactic distances. Tiamat does not move, it grows. And in the silence of the void, it dreams of something beyond devouring. Control. Faced with 1,000 small wars, the Imperium's response was brutal and simple: extermination. The Exterminatus Writ, the ultimate sanction, became a weapon of necessity rather than rarity. Worlds suspected of Tyrannid infection were burned, bombarded, or vaporized without hesitation. Entire sectors were sacrificed to save others. Millions of innocents died so that billions more might live. But even as they burned the skies, the Inquisition knew the truth. You cannot kill what learns from death. Every exterminatus created shockwaves in the Tyrannid network. Every burning world sent new data, new understanding back into the hive mind. To the Tyranids, human genocide was simply another variable to study. With each splinter's rise, the shadow in the warp deepened. It was no longer an isolated phenomenon, but a growing stain spreading across psychic space. Astropaths began losing the ability to navigate whole regions. Entire subsectors became blind to communication. Ships disappeared mid-transit, their crews driven mad by silence. For the Inquisition, this became known as the Great Veil, a creeping fog that hid the true scale of the Tyrannid threat. There were rumors that some worlds were consumed without anyone even knowing, that the shadow itself masked their destruction until nothing was left to report. And so the galaxy's lights began to go out, one by one, in total darkness. History rarely remembers the small worlds, but every system that vanished under the splinter fleets had its own story. There was Gathalamor, a shrine world whose final hours were spent in prayer. chanting litanies until the swarm drowned out their hymns. There was Miral Prime, where the scythes of the Emperor made their desperate last stand against Hive Fleet Dagon, turning their fortress into a tomb. There was Hammond's Reach, where the sky turned purple as spores consumed the atmosphere, and the last survivors walked willingly into the sea rather than be taken. Each became a ghost story told by travelers, each a flickering signal in the endless dark, and the hive mind remembered them all. For the Death Watch, the age of the splinter fleets was a nightmare without end. They could no longer fight a single enemy, they had to fight everywhere. Kill teams were scattered across the stars, striking wherever the swarm appeared, purging nests and assassinating synapse creatures before they could multiply. Entire fortresses were emptied to sustain the fight. The Death Watch became the galaxy's immune system, always reacting, never resting. Within their halls, the librarians spoke of strange things. Dreams of vast oceans of biomass, visions of stars blinking out one by one. Some began to hear voices in their sleep. Not human voices, but whispers that sounded like their own thoughts, repeating a single message. "You are food." They prayed harder after that. Not every Tyrannid invasion begins with a fleet. Some begin quietly in basements and sewers decades before the first spore ever falls. The Genestealer cults, insidious infiltrators, half human and half Tyrannid, spread across the Imperium like cancers of faith. They worship the coming of the Great Devourer as a holy ascension, believing themselves chosen to be absorbed into something divine. On world after world, these cults prepared the way, sabotaging defenses, spreading corruption, softening planets for the inevitable arrival of the Hive fleets. The Imperium often mistook them for heretics or mutants, never realizing the truth until it was far too late. When the skies finally darkened and the spore rain began, the cults knelt in joy. To them, death was deliverance, and as they were consumed, their biomass carried with it everything they had learned about their human hosts. Even fanaticism can be digested. Between the splinter fleets and the Inquisition, a hidden war raged in the shadows. Ordo Xenos agents tracked suspected infestations, purging entire populations with virus bombs or orbital fire. Deathwatch kill teams vanished on deep infiltration missions. Rogue traders hunted drifting bioships in the void, hoping to profit from their remains. Even the Mechanicus waged secret battles, experimenting with captured samples in pursuit of forbidden knowledge. It was a war fought in whispers, with no glory and no end. Every victory was temporary. Every success a delay, because no matter how many Tyranids were burned, dissected, or atomized, there were always more. There were always more. Some Inquisitors began to wonder, quietly, fearfully, if the splinter fleets truly were separate. If the hive mind existed beyond time and distance, could all the fleets share thought? Could the same intelligence direct Gorgon and Hydra and Jormungandr at once, as a single hand directs its fingers? If so, then every local war was not an isolated skirmish, but part of a larger design. Perhaps the hive mind was testing the galaxy, mapping its responses, measuring its reflexes, learning its patterns. If that were true, then everything since Behemoth had merely been reconnaissance. A taste, a study, a prelude. The galaxy is very old and it does not forget. Every race, every world, every soul carries its scars. For humanity, the Tyranids became a quiet fear whispered in the dark, a story to keep soldiers vigilant, a myth to frighten children. But among the Death Watch, the Ultramarines and the Ordo Xenos, the memory never faded. They knew that every splinter, every tendril, every bioship drifting in silence was part of something far greater. Something still coming. And though the splinter fleet seemed scattered and weak, the wise understood the truth. The Tyranids had not been defeated. They had adapted. They were learning the shape of the galaxy, one corpse at a time. And so the stars continued to burn, worlds rebuilt, faith endured. But across the void, the echoes of Kraken whispered to one another, faint, resonant, connected by threads of thought no human mind could follow. Each splinter fleet carried its memories back into the dark between galaxies. Each fragment rejoined the song, and deep beyond the galactic rim, the Great Devourer listened. It had tasted Behemoth's strength. It had savored Kraken's cunning. It had learned from Gorgon, Hydra, Jormungandr, Tiamat, and 1,000 more. The next swarm would be greater than any before. It would not come from the sides nor the top. It would rise from below, a tide unseen, a shadow reborn. The galaxy did not yet know its name, but soon it would. In the cold dark beneath the galactic plane, where even starlight falters and ancient void currents drift like frozen rivers, something vast began to move. Slowly, patiently, with purpose. It had no eyes, no engines, no metal hulls. It did not shimmer like a fleet of starships. It was older, simpler, purer. It was hunger, given shape. After Behemoth's fall, after Kraken's shattering, the galaxy had grown used to shadows along its edges. But the next shadow came from below. It did not fall from the rim. It rose from the abyss. And when it broke the surface, the stars themselves seemed to shudder. The Imperium would call it Hive Fleet Leviathan. And its coming would mark the beginning of the Third Tyrannic War. The warning came, as always, too late. At first, it was a trickle of strange reports. Drifting debris, unexplained disappearances, psychic interference. Ships traveling near the galactic underbelly began to vanish. Void-born navigators spoke of strange dreams, oceans of flesh, endless tunnels of bone, and a voice that whispered, "Feed." The Adeptus Mechanicus dismissed the dreams as warp echoes. The Administratum blamed pirates, warp storms, anything at all. But in the sealed archives of the Ordo Xenos, Inquisitor Cryptman read the signs clearly. He saw the same pattern he had seen before, and he knew what it meant. "It comes again," he wrote in his final open transmission to Terra. "And this time, it comes from below." His words went largely ignored. But deep within Segmentum Tempestus, faint gravitational distortions began to register across multiple systems. Distortions too vast to be fleets, too fluid to be natural phenomena. It was not a fleet entering the galaxy. It was a fleet emerging from beneath it. When Leviathan finally revealed itself, it did not arrive like Behemoth's roaring tide, nor Kraken's spreading arms. It erupted. From the black gulf below the galactic plane came two vast tendrils. Colossal organic arms reaching upward like the limbs of some cosmic Leviathan breaking through a frozen sea. Each arm spread across thousands of light years, splitting again and again into smaller tendrils that branched like veins through the void. Together they formed a pattern so immense that even the most seasoned Imperial cartographers refused to believe the scale. Two vast prongs, one toward the galactic north, one toward the south, converging on the heart of the Imperium itself. Leviathan was not attacking edges, it was attacking everything. The arrival of Leviathan brought with it a psychic silence deeper than any felt before. Entire sectors went dark, astropathic choirs died mid-sentence. The Astronomican's light flickered in far-off systems, dimmed by something pressing against the warp itself. The shadow in the warp had become an ocean. Where Behemoth had silenced worlds, Leviathan silenced regions. Where Kraken had confused psychers, Leviathan crushed them. Across the galaxy, nightmares spread like disease. Psychers screamed of great serpents coiling beneath reality, of eyes the size of suns staring upward. It was not just a fleet, it was a feeling, the weight of inevitability made manifest. And as the silence deepened, the first worlds began to burn. The first major world to fall was Tarsus Ultra, a rich agri-world deep within the Ultima Segmentum, and one of the first to encounter the new Hive fleet. When the first mycetic spores began to fall, planetary defense forces reacted swiftly. They had trained for this. They knew the pattern of Tyrannic war, but this was not the same enemy. Leviathan's organisms were different, more efficient, more focused. Gaunts with reflective chitin that deflected lasfire. Warriors that could burrow and emerge behind the lines. Synapse creatures that shielded the swarm from psychic attack. Each unit was not merely evolved, but engineered, a living countermeasure to everything humanity had learned. The defenders fought valiantly. The Ultramarines themselves arrived under Marneus Calgar's command, reinforcing the world with their experience from Macragge. For weeks, the war raged across the farmlands and hive complexes of Tarsis Ultra. Orbital bombardments scoured continents. Bioships were burned from the sky, and yet the swarm adapted faster than ever before. Each countermeasure was countered in turn. In the end, victory came only through desperation. Calgar ordered an orbital saturation strike, burning atmosphere, oceans, and all. The swarm was destroyed, but so was the planet. Tarsis Ultra was declared dead, another corpse fed to the swarm's memory. And Leviathan simply moved on. As the war spread, Inquisitor Kryptman became a ghost, moving from system to system, always one step ahead of the hive mind. He had long since abandoned protocol, condemned by his peers for methods too extreme to tolerate. Kryptman's insight was terrifyingly simple. You could not kill the Tyranids. You could only redirect them. He studied Leviathan's tendrils and saw their convergence paths, and so he enacted his most infamous act, the Kryptman line. He ordered the deliberate destruction of entire worlds in Leviathan's path, creating barren, lifeless corridors. A wall of dead systems the swarm could not feed upon. Billions were sacrificed. Every planet burned. The logic was brutal. If the Tyranids consumed to move forward, deny them food. And for a time, it worked. Deprived of biomass, Leviathan slowed. Its tendrils thinned, its advance stuttered. But Kryptman's plan had a flaw, one even he did not foresee. Desperate for sustenance, part of the swarm turned toward the Orc Empire of Octarius. In the Octarius sector, countless Orc warbands had gathered, forming an empire of endless conflict, a place where battle never ceased. When Leviathan turned its hunger toward them, Kryptman believed he had found salvation. He guided the swarm directly into Orc space, reasoning that the two species would destroy each other. And so began the Octarius War, a conflict so vast and violent that its echoes still shake the galaxy. Tyrannid met Orc in a perpetual storm of destruction. Planets changed hands daily, devoured and rebuilt, burned and consumed. For every Orc that fell, more spores were released, birthing new warriors. For every Tyrannid slain, its biomass was absorbed and reborn. Neither side could win. Neither side could stop. They fed each other. The war became an eternal feeding loop, a self-sustaining nightmare. And while it raged, Leviathan's other tendrils continued their advance unchecked. Kryptman had created a solution worse than the problem. Of all the worlds threatened by Leviathan, none would bear its shadow longer than Baal, home of the Blood Angels. Once a dead moon turned paradise by the Emperor's hand, Baal had long stood as a symbol of noble endurance. A desert world turned to gold through faith and blood. When Leviathan came, it did not come alone. It came in twin waves, one tendril descending upon Baal Secundus, the other upon Baal itself. For years, the Blood Angels and their successors prepared. They fortified every canyon, every fortress, every inch of sand. They knew this would be their final stand. When the swarm arrived, it blotted out the skies. The ground trembled under the weight of endless bioforms. The air filled with shrieking gargoyles. The seas boiled with digestion pools. For weeks, Baal became hell itself, an endless siege of claws, fire, and faith. Commander Dante led the defense personally, his armor blackened by ichor and flame. Each night, fewer warriors answered roll call. Each dawn, the horizon glowed red with fire and blood, and still the angels fought, even when the swarm breached the fortress walls, even when their gene seed vaults were overrun, even when the skies fell silent and the last thunderhawk was lost. They fought, because that is what blood angels do. And then, something impossible happened. As the final bastions of Baal prepared for their last breath, the sky tore open. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, split the galaxy in two. A wound in reality, a storm of raw warp energy that consumed everything in its path. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, the stars went out. The shadow and the warp met the roar of the immaterium, and the two horrors clashed in silence. When light returned, the Hive Fleet was gone. What remained of Baal was devastation. Blackened sand, shattered mountains, oceans of ash. Of the Blood Angels' 10,000 sons, fewer than 1,000 still lived. And in orbit, drifting among wreckage, were ships. Not Tyrannid ships, Imperial ships. The Indomitus Crusade had arrived. The Primaris reinforcements, led by Robut Guilliman himself, had found Baal at the very brink. And perhaps by miracle or fate, the Great Rift had scattered the swarm long enough for the angels to survive. Leviathan's tendril had been broken, but the cost was almost everything. The destruction of Baal did not end Leviathan. Its tendrils remained, countless splinters scattered across the galaxy, feeding and regrowing. Even crippled, the hive mind endured. And as the Indomitus Crusade pushed to reclaim Imperial territory, the Tyranids adapted again. In the shadows of the Great Rift, new bioforms began to appear. Creatures that could survive the warp's raw storms, living ships that could navigate where no Imperial vessel dared. Leviathan was learning to cross realities. Even the psychic silence of the shadow could not shield humanity forever. The war was not over. It was merely changing shape. With Leviathan's spread came an age of endless vigilance. The Death Watch declared Exterminatus Protocol Omicron, dedicating entire fortress monasteries to the study and extermination of the Leviathan strain. But even they could not keep up. Every time they learned a new pattern, the hive mind evolved. Entire watch stations were consumed in silence, their last transmissions nothing but static and the sound of chitons scraping against steel. Yet they persisted, because that is what the Death Watch do. In the void, they whispered prayers before boarding the living ships, and in the darkness between stars, they reminded themselves, the Xenos is not evil. The Xenos does not hate. The Xenos simply is. And we stand against it because no one else can. By the war's end, Leviathan had changed the galaxy forever. The Imperium's eastern fringe lay in ruin. Thousands of systems were lost, their names erased, their coordinates classified. The Mechanicus archives overflowed with forbidden data, and the Inquisition's vaults groaned under the weight of containment orders. But worst of all, humanity's belief in its own supremacy was gone. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had seen itself as the center of creation, beset by enemies, yes, but unbroken. Leviathan proved otherwise. The galaxy did not revolve around mankind. It was only food. And so the Third Tyrannic War ended, not with victory but with survival. The tendrils of Leviathan still writhed across the void, feeding quietly, spreading slowly, waiting patiently. The Imperium rebuilt as it always does, patching the wounds with faith and fire. But somewhere deep beneath the galactic plane, where light does not reach, the hive mind stirred. It remembered Behemoth's rage. It remembered Kraken's cunning. It remembered the resilience of Baal, the taste of Astarte's gene seed, the psychic feast of the Great Rift. It remembered everything. And in that endless hunger, it dreamed of what would come next. Those few psychers who dare reach too far into the warp sometimes hear it, a whisper beneath the noise, low and endless, like the breathing of a creature too vast to see. They speak of shapes in the void, of worlds already gone, of a shadow still rising from below. And when they awaken, trembling, they write a single line in their logbooks before the Inquisition burns them for madness. Leviathan still feeds. There are worlds that seem to hold back the dark by the act of existing. Baal was one of these. A red world beneath a redder sky, its sands once poisoned by ancient wars, its moons blasted and scarred. And yet from that ruin rose a brotherhood who carried themselves as if every sunrise were a vow. The Blood Angels did not speak of perfection, they pursued it. In art and war, in pageant and prayer, they tried to be worthy of a memory older than any living man. The angel who had walked with them and the nobility he had demanded from himself. When Leviathan came, it came to that memory, and for a time it seemed as if even memory could bleed. The approach of the swarm was felt first as pressure. A lowering of the sky, a deepening of the quiet. Voxlinks frayed. Astropathic choirs fell to their knees mid-hymn. Even the desert winds changed, moving as if pushed by a weight that had no body. On Baal, the chapter assembled. In the citadel that crowns angels' fall, in vaults lined with sarcophagi and banners faded by centuries of desert air, the Blood Angels took their places. Dante, old and unbowed, walked the line of his sons. The sanguinary guards stood like golden statues brought to life. Chaplains traced blessings across brow plates. Sanguinary priests tended reliquaries that housed the future, the gene seed that made their line possible. All this beneath a sky already dimming. Around Baal's orbit gathered the vessels of successor kin. Angels in carmine, angels sanguine. Blood drinkers, flesh tearers, and others whose names are written like oaths upon cracked stone. Across the broader system, warning beacons pulsed. On Baal Secundus, the aspirant tribes looked up and felt, though they could not name it, the breath of a predator that filled the void between stars. Some prayers are not for victory. Some are only for endurance. These were such prayers. It is said that the stones of Baal remember Sanguinius, that the wind through certain canyons finds a note akin to song, that in the twilight between heat and night a man can look at the horizon and imagine wings, because this is where an angel rose. The chapter remembers more practical things. It remembers how to fight from rock and ruin, how to draw the enemy down narrow defiles, how to make heat and distance allies. It remembers what it is to be outnumbered and yet not outmatched. So the defenses were laid not only as lines but as lessons. Fortresses were not walls, they were instruments. Kill zones were tuned like strings, overlapping fields of fire tuned as carefully as a musician tunes a harp. Minefields were seeded like careful, patient crops. And then the stars went out. Leviathan's tendrils did not fall as a single curtain. The invasion came as two hands reaching, one toward Baal Secundus, the cradle world where the chapter's aspirants were found among the tribes, and one toward Baal itself, the seat of relics, command, and the vaults that held the Blood Angels' future in carefully sealed containers. Sporefall began as a whisper and became weather. The sky bruised and opened. Fire rioted along the upper atmosphere. Where the first pods met sand, they became mouths. Digestion pits blooming like obscene flowers, feeder tendrils tasting the air, carpenter ants of chitin building the shapes the war would need next. On Secundus, the tribes rallied with locks and courage. On Baal, the angels descended through dust storms in precise, beautiful lines, red upon red, a geometry of duty. At first, there was clarity in the killing. Termagants scythed down by disciplined bursts, Hormagaunts broken against lines of overlapping flame, Lictors found and burned from crevices with the methodical hatred that only those who have hunted long can manage. But Leviathan had not come to learn. It had come to apply what it had learned already. The second wave was immune to lessons from the first. Under the worst skies, men do not only fight enemies, they fight themselves. The sons of Sanguinius carry two long shadows, the red thirst that calls them toward the beauty of perfect violence, and the black rage that drowns them in their Primarch's final vision, substituting the present with the last fatal hour upon the vengeful spirit. Baal knows how to live with these scars. The chaplains know the rites. The sanguinary priests know the tonics and the chains. In quieter ages, this balance holds. In siege, balance is a forgotten luxury. As the swarm multiplied and the days bled together, the black rage took more and more. Warriors stared into the middle distance and saw not desert but a war master's halls. Some broke from the line as if answering trumpets no one else could hear. Others stood too still and had to be guided back to motion with a hand upon the pauldron and a soft command through a private vox. And the red thirst, always subtle, twisted duty into a song of precision and ecstasy. Bolter drill became dance. Blade work became art that bordered worship. The Blood Angels are not ashamed of this. They acknowledge it, and then they go on. But in that long night, the price of going on was carved into them like script. In every war, there is a point at which symbol and function become one. For the Blood Angels, the Sanguinary Guard are this point, golden, winged, implacable. They are the memory of Sanguinius made kinetic. When the first Bio-Titans crested the dunes, when hive nodes rose like infected cathedrals, the Guard went where the lines were breaking. They descended through sleet that was not rain but liquefied sky, through clouds that were not clouds but drifting spore. Words cannot convey the hush that falls across a channel when a Sanguinary Guard cohort arrives. The human voice lowers. Even the machine spirit seems to smooth its edges. In that hush, the Guard land with the gentleness of certainty and the ferocity of mandate. They do not boast. They do not explain. Golden figures moved through storm and thorn, power weapons drawing calligraphy on the air. When they could not be everywhere at once, legends spread in their absence. A squad that held a canyon alone for a day and a night. A single guardsman found standing amid a hill of chitin, still upright with power spear planted and armor torn to the undersuit, internals flickering like tiny suns. Legends aren't logs. They are what a people choose to remember. And that choosing is truth of a different kind. The aspirant tribes are the root of the chapter's future. From them are chosen the boys who will cross the desert to the trial stones. From those who endure are taken the seeds of tomorrow's angels. Leviathan understood. No, better to say, Leviathan functioned in such a way that this area of the system could not be left unconsumed. Whether cunning or consequence, the result was the same. Secundus became a second hell. There is a tone of desperation that never raises its voice. You can hear it in a calm order to fall back 200 meters. You can hear it when a transport pilot requests permission to lift before the scheduled mark, stating simply, "They are inside the air." Evacuations ran without rest. Astartes ferried the young and the chosen. Chapter serfs and sisters hospitaller triaged in dust-choked Medicaid tents lit by unreliable lumens. Mortal soldiers widened corridors with shaped charges, the better that another line might form further back. Where the Leviathan reached, Secundus bled. Where the angels stood, Secundus lived. Not all seeds were saved. More than enough were. Sometimes victory is not in the many, but in the sum. Deep within Baal's red rock, chambers hold the chapter's gene seed, their past and their possibility, stored not as hope, but as work to be done later. The vault doors are older than records. Their seals are layered with liturgies, codes, and a kind of quiet fear. When the swarm breached secondary access tunnels, when the Vox map showed contacts moving like quicksilver down shafts never meant for feet, Dante sent veterans whose names do not appear in triumph lists. They were not there to take ground. They were there to prevent the future from being eaten. There are fights that have music. There are fights that are just a rhythm in the blood. The battles in the vault corridors had neither. They were method, shot counts, airborne particulates and filtration cycles, heat management and door cycles that must not fail. It was sacrament, but not the sort that stirs the heart. It was the kind that steadies the hand. In the after-action pict captures, you can see the dark polish on the vault door. You can see a palm print that will never fade because no one will ever polish it away. You can see small letters etched with a combat knife at the edge of the frame. For him who waits, the door held. Wars are conversations, though the language is brutal. One side speaks, the other answers. Leviathan spoke in adaptation, carapace against heat, synapse against psychic strike, burrower against fixed position. The angels answered in geometry and grace, in sacrifice and in a refusal to grant the enemy an easy pattern. Drop zones rotated unpredictably. Narrow causeways were left unmined for days to invite a flow that would be cut by a lateral strike when the density reached a modeled peak. In some canyons, ammo was rationed not for lack, but for cadence. The best beat for bolter, melta, heavy support to achieve a particular symphony of attrition. This is not romance. It is craft at a level where craft becomes prayer. Through all of this, the flesh terrors fought with their particular music. Raw, direct, brilliant, terrible. In joint operations, they filled the role the moment demanded. A blade thrust into the bull's eye of the swarm. After they stepped back into shadow. The names of the successor chapters passed like low bells. Angels vermilion, lamenters, blood drinkers, angels anchormine, angels penitent. Each brought an old lesson wrapped in a new wound. On the Macravox net, Dante's voice remained level. He asked nothing he would not do. He promised nothing he could not pay. There is a kind of fatigue that becomes the shape of a day. The sky never clears, the horizon never settles. The enemy's number is a concept, not a count. The metrics become internal. Another hour, another corridor, another pod burned out of the sky. Another child added to the manifest, another brother set down and made comfortable the way you would lay a sword you cannot carry further. Sanguinary priests moved like candle flames from squad to squad, taking readings, administering what could be administered, choosing when to speak the soft words that give men permission to accept what their bodies already know. Chaplains revised their litanies not because the old ones failed, but because the words are a bridge, and sometimes you must lay a different bridge across the same chasm. Some prayers were one sentence long, some were silent. A hand on a helm, a nod, a look that says here. In the Medici bays, sisters and serfs learned the strange biology of Tyrannid toxins by touch and failure and sometimes success. They kept maps of what worked on walls that shook with bombardment and sang old Imperial hymns under their breath when there was no time for full rites. Baal has always taught patience by denying comfort. The lesson held. Even the best prepared mind is surprised by the impossible. In the hour when Baal's bastions were down to last reserves, when the flight decks lay cluttered with the wrecks of aircraft that had no parts left to swap, when Dante had tallied his options and found each one ending at the same door, the sky fractured. It did not break along any seam a man could draw. It ruptured like truth. The cicatrix maledictum opened, a wound cut into reality itself, the galaxy's light drawn through a slit as if the universe were the eyelid of a god who had decided to wake bleeding. The shadow in the warp and the howl of raw immaterium collided, silence and scream, void and storm. Accounts diverged there as they always do when men try to speak about things language was not built to hold. Some say demons came and fed not on men but on the swarm, that the two hungers met and made ruin of each other. Some say time turned upon itself like a snake and that the swarm, enraged or merely obeying the logic of survival, pulled back as instinct might pull a hand from flame. Some say an angel walked again and barred a door no mortal could have closed. What is solid is aftermath. The immediate assault slackened. Orbital signatures shifted. The field's geometry changed in a way no commander in any theater could have planned. Into that breath, just long enough to be called a mercy, the Indomitus Crusade arrived. Hulls bearing a new genetic promise cut through skies that had not yet remembered how to be blue. Robut Guilliman's banners flickered like returning constellations. Respite is not rescue. Rescue is not redemption. But in that sequence, survival is sometimes found. Reinforcements did not only mean ships and shells. They meant men, but not merely more of the same. They were the first of the Primara's sons to wear the red. Taller, engineered by arts that walk on the narrow ledge between miracle and presumption. Bearing marks that would become familiar quickly and stir debates that would last longer still. For the Blood Angels, acceptance was not a single act. It was 1,000 small acceptances. New battle brothers standing at attention in halls still smelling of ash. Unfamiliar gene-right protocols laid beside recipes preserved from the second founding. A new silhouette moving like an old one, learning the particular restraint that the sons of the angel must teach themselves daily. There is tenderness in instruction when it is given by those who remember who taught them. The sanguinary priests took careful measurements. Chaplains listened more than they spoke. Veterans told stories with just enough detail to keep a flaw from becoming a habit. The Primaris did not come to replace the dead. No one could. They came to carry forward a music whose notes would bend but not break. Dante, who had survived too many endings to believe in simple beginnings, put his hand upon the shoulder of a warrior twice as broad as any boy he had chosen from the stones of Secundus and said only, "You are ours." Sometimes that is the vow the future needs. In the nights that followed, if nights they were, for the great rift had made a mockery of day, the chapter counted. They counted gene seed vials saved, vaults intact, names spoken and carved, ships that could be made whole again, sectors reachable, successor chapters fragments by the tens and by the handful. They counted plazas where citizens could gather without seeing a digestion pit from where they stood. They counted the number of flights necessary to move the aspirant children back from wherever the last lift had left them. They counted ammunition and promethium, rations and medici staples, not because they loved the arithmetic, but because logistics is love in war. The proof that someone intends you to live tomorrow, and they counted the dead. Not only because it is right, but because the dead deserve to be arranged into a form that looks like meaning. Some numbers went into ledgers, others were entrusted to memory. Brother so-and-so always turned his head slightly to listen when you spoke. Sister such-and-such never allowed a patient to be without a hand to hold, even when she had to hold two herself. The chapter is a house. The way a house keeps its dead says whether it believes it is still a house. Leadership ages a man in ways metal cannot hide. Dante had been old before Leviathan. Afterward, he wore that age not as decay, but as patina, history made visible. When Guilliman named him warden of what would become known as Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy swallowed nightly by the rift's shadow, Dante did not answer with triumph. He answered with work, rearmament schedules, liaison protocols with successors who had lost their homeworlds and now existed as flotillas, priorities for worlds that must be held so that other worlds might be possible. The angels have always kept their grief private when they can. Dante's grief became administrative. There are forms that only a pen heavy with sorrow can complete. Declares Baal secured. Declares Baal wounded, declares Baal eternal. Titles mean little on the line where Bolter meets chitin. They mean much in the long night, where men must decide where to stand so that dawn has a place to find them. Dante chose and chose again, and keeps choosing. The red thirst did not evaporate with relief. The black rage did not loosen its teeth because the enemy withdrew. These things do not yield to victory because they do not answer to it. They are weather within the blood, so the chaplains carried their crozy like walking staffs and went the rounds. The priests brewed, measured, recorded, and did the gentler work of listening without judgment when a warrior came at an ungodly hour to say, "I can taste something sweet in the barrel smoke, and I like it too much." They built new cages, not iron ones, but habits and rites and words. They painted frescoes where the young could see what beauty looks like when it is offered upward rather than inward. They taught the Primaris sons where to place the tip of a blade not only for effect, but for grace. The Blood Angels' answer to the flaws in their blood has always been to keep more beauty than the darkness can drink. So they made music, they carved, they recited epics while they cleaned weapons. They taught the names of sculptors and saints to boys who had been scavengers under a pink sky. This is strategy too, Baal went on. The sands took back footprints. The wind sanded sharp edges to curves. In certain hours you could walk between the outer bastions and hear only the soft arrhythmic thrum of repair servitors at a distance. But the quiet was not peace, it was interval. Out in the wider dark, Leviathan writhed still. It had been diverted, not destroyed. Splinters learned from splinters. Genestealer cults in far cities dreamt of deliverance and did their dirty miracles beneath hab blocks whose roofs caught the rain in old ways. The Death Watch resumed its liturgy of boarding and burning. The Inquisition rehearsed the old terrible arithmetic. Fleets moved according to tables that consider time a weapon and distance a cruelty. Baal's quiet, then, was a well. From that well, the angels drew water and memory and resolve. They would need all three. There are nights on Baal when the dust thins and you can stand on the parapet and trace constellations the way a lover traces scars. In those patterns, the angels read not fate, but a kind of instruction. Stand, endure, embellish what can be embellished. Refuse what cannot be allowed. Carry the beautiful things as far as you can, and when you can no longer carry them, hand them to the next. Some say that on certain nights a shape like wings can be seen not in the sky, but in the arrangement of stars and the negative space between them. Superstition, perhaps, or perhaps the universe is kind enough to allow symbols even when it denies certainties. Either way, the lesson is the same. Baal remains, the chapter remains, the long night remains. And so do the men who dress for war as if it were a ceremony and then make of war something more than survival, a manner of keeping faith with an angel who once looked at ruined ground and decided to build a home there. In every age there are wars that burn like stars, bright, brief, and gone. And then there are wars that never end, because they have become habitats. The Octarius War is one such place. It is not history. It is ecology. It is war as the natural state of matter. Before the Tyranids ever came, the Octarius sector was already a legend whispered by voidfarers and inquisitors alike. A cluster of worlds bound by madness, muscle, and mirthless laughter. It was the heart of an orc empire. Not a loose collection of tribes as the Imperium often imagines them, but a genuine empire of green-skin rule. An organized chaos guided by war bosses of ancient lineage. On the world of Octarius itself, continents had been chewed down to mud by constant warfare. Mountains were dug out and replaced with fortress cities shaped like iron teeth. Seas boiled from the fallout of unending conflict. And through it all, the orcs thrived. They were born for this. They lived for it. Every death was a rebirth. Every fallen orc seeded the ground for more fungus, more spores, more wah. The skies were thick with smoke and laughter. To outsiders, it was horror. To the orcs, it was home. When Hive Fleet Leviathan rose from below the galactic plane, it moved with terrifying inevitability. Every world it touched was stripped to bedrock. Every defense failed. And one haunted man, saw what it would become. Inquisitor Cryptman. He had survived the first two Tyrannic Wars. He had studied Behemoth and Kraken until his soul grew brittle. He had mapped Leviathan's tendrils as one might chart the veins of a growing tumor, and he knew the truth. Humanity could not win. Not this time. So he did what Inquisitors sometimes do when faced with the impossible. He made a sin so great that only the galaxy itself could judge him. Cryptman's idea was simple in concept and apocalyptic in execution. The hive mind fed on biomass. Deprive it of food, and it would wither or turn. He ordered exterminatus upon dozens of Imperial worlds in Leviathan's path, worlds not yet touched by the swarm but doomed soon enough. Entire populations were burned away by cyclonic torpedoes and viral plagues, 1,000 billion lives erased, not to save themselves but to create nothing. An empty corridor of dead space, barren and lifeless, stretching between Leviathan and the Imperial core. A scar in the galaxy meant to starve the swarm. At first it worked. The Hive Fleet's momentum slowed. Its advance faltered. Deprived of sustenance, Leviathan began to divide its attention, seeking other prey. That was what Cryptman wanted. He opened the eastern flank deliberately, redirecting the swarm toward a region crawling with life. A region already consumed by war. The Octarius Empire. The orcs of Octarius were the galaxy's greatest reservoir of biomass after humanity itself. And they were already at war, already spilling blood by the oceans. If the Tyranids fed on life and the orcs were endless life, then let the monsters feed on each other. Cryptman called it biostrategic diversion. The High Lords called it madness. They excommunicated him, declared him extremis diabolus, hunted him across 100 worlds. But by then his work was already done. The tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan, hungry and desperate, found the orcs of Octarius, and the greatest war in recorded history began. There are no words fit for what happened next, though chroniclers have tried for centuries. Imagine two infinities colliding. Imagine hunger meeting joy. Imagine a devouring god finding prey that wants to be eaten because every bite means a fight. The first contact came on the fringe world of Gorala. Hive ships drifted into the system, pulsing with life. Orc rocks were already there, orbiting like moons carved by idiots and engines. The Tyranids descended in silence. The orcs opened fire while cheering. Every surface of Gorala turned to battle. Spore clouds met Daka storms. Carnifexes charged Stompus across fields of molten iron. Zoanthropes traded psychic bolts with weird boys whose heads exploded from the joy of it. And through the wreckage, a new word began to echo across the orc vox. Best. Fight. Ever. Leviathan learned fast. The orcs learned faster. Every skirmish became an exchange of evolution. The hive mind absorbed orc flesh, analyzing its fungal nature. It learned to digest spores, to neutralize regenerative tissue, to weaponize orc blood into acidic bile. The orcs in turn scavenged the Tyrannid dead. They tore off claws and spines, hammered them onto trucks, and grew crude imitations of Tyrannid weapons from half-rotten biomass. Within a year, Gorala was gone, devoured not by victory but by saturation. Both sides had eaten too much, grown too fast, and moved on to the next feast. The war spread like an infection. Dozens of systems burned. Worlds turned into jungles of fungus and chitin where neither side ever truly died. The Imperium sent observation fleets. None returned. Octarius became a self-sustaining battlefield. The Tyranids harvested orcs. The orcs multiplied in response. Every loss for one side was nourishment for the other. The balance became perfect, too perfect. Planetary crusts cracked under the weight of constant bombardment. Atmospheres turned to chemical soup. Space itself glittered with debris and drifting corpses, both metallic and organic. Hive ships and orc cruisers fought in low orbit, crashed, and then continued their battles on the ground. Where the Tyranids built digestion pools, the orcs built fortresses on their edges, daring the swarm to come again. There were no civilians, no innocents, only warriors, spores, and hunger. The war had achieved equilibrium. It would never stop. At first, the orcs only fought harder, but the longer the war dragged, the more they changed. The constant pressure of the hive mind pushed against the collective orc way energy, a psychic gestalt of violence and willpower. And something new began to happen. The orcs grew smarter, not individually but collectively. Their Wa field, amplified by unending battle, began to mimic the unity of the hive mind. War bosses became strategists. Weird boys channeled energies that burned with eerie precision. Some tribes began breeding bio-creatures of their own, spore-borne hybrids grown from Tyrannid tissue fed on orc blood. Mech boys welded bone to steel, creating tanks that bled when wounded and roared when angry. It was as if the orcs, through sheer force of their own belief, were becoming something that could rival the hive mind in scale. If the Tyranids were hunger made flesh, the orcs were laughter made endless. And now, laughter and hunger were devouring one another forever. The Tyranids are not sentient as men are. They do not hate, they do not dream, but they remember. Each death teaches, each victory refines. From the endless crucible of Octarius, Leviathan learned adaptation at an impossible rate. It developed new forms designed specifically for orc war zones, razorfiends, multi-limbed predators that thrived on spore-rich air, pyrovore titans, enormous siege beasts capable of melting fungus jungles into slag, synapse reapers, command organisms tuned to counter the psychic noise of the orc. Waig, some Magos biologists who intercepted splinter samples claimed the creatures displayed mirrored aggression, as though the hive mind had begun to enjoy the fight as much as the orcs themselves. This was the true horror of Octarius. The Tyranids were learning to play. At the edge of the war zone, Imperial monitoring stations remained silent, cloaked, always afraid. Deathwatch fortresses sent kill teams to observe, to gather data, and to die without record. Their reports, those that survived, describe a place where war is constant background noise, where no night falls because the sky glows with perpetual flame. Inquisitors who reviewed these reports sealed them under Omega clearance, their contents forbidden even to other branches of the Ordo Xenos. One line appears again and again in the fragments that leaked. If either side wins, the galaxy ends, and yet no one intervenes, because the alternative, to let either hunger loose unchecked, is worse. So the Imperium watches, and waits, and prays that the balance holds. The Octarius War has lasted centuries now, and in that time it has become something more than conflict. It is the galaxy's mirror, two races without mercy or morality locked together, consuming each other in an endless act of creation. They are predator and prey, weapon and target, student and teacher. Each defines the other. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, philosophers, yes, even in the Imperium there are still some who think, whisper that Octarius is proof that the universe prefers balance. That perhaps without Kryptman's madness, the Tyranids would have consumed everything by now. But balance is not mercy, it is merely delay. And delay in this age is the closest thing to hope. Though Octarius remains the central inferno, echoes of the war have spread far beyond its borders. Spore fields of orc and Tyrannid origin have been detected across multiple sectors. In some cases, the two species coexist in hybrid ecosystems, fungal jungles that birth both orcoid and Tyrannid organisms in strange symbiosis. Human populations caught in these zones report madness, mutation, and worship. Cultists arise calling themselves the Dual Maw, venerating both the Great Devourer and Gork, or maybe Mork, as twin gods of consumption and conflict. To them, the Octarius War is not tragedy, It is revelation, a vision of the universe's true nature, endless, cyclical, self-devouring. The Inquisition burns them wherever they appear. But belief, like biomass, has a way of growing back. No one knows how Kryptman died. Some say he fled to the eastern fringe, hunting for a weapon to end what he had begun. Others claim he was captured and devoured by a splinter of Leviathan, his genetic memories digested and shared among the swarm. There are even whispers that the hive mind itself remembers him, that somewhere deep in its collective memory there exists a pattern of thought shaped like a man who outsmarted it once. Perhaps in its own way the hive mind respects him, or perhaps it is simply waiting to finish the meal. Either way, his legacy endures. A galaxy bought a few more centuries of life, paid for with billions of dead worlds. From a distance, Octarius glows faintly in the void. Its suns are dimmed by dust and spore. Its worlds shimmer with atmospheric fires that never go out. It is a wound that cauterizes itself over and over again. In orbit, wreckage forms rings around the larger planets, an endless belt of iron and bone moving in slow harmony. Sometimes Imperial augurs detect movement patterns within those rings that suggest something alive, something vast, circling patiently. But none dare go closer. Not anymore. The orcs fight because they must. The Tyranids feed because they must. And together they have made something no god or emperor ever imagined. A perpetual motion machine built from hate and hunger. In a fortress on the rim of the sector, an old Death Watch captain once wrote these words before his final deployment. I have looked into Octarius from orbit. It is beautiful, a beauty born of purity, two truths in endless argument. It is what the galaxy was always meant to be. We are the anomaly. We who think peace is natural. He never returned. The fortress went silent 2 weeks later. It is assumed destroyed, but its last data packet carried one final image. A single orc standing upon a pile of corpses laughing up at the stars while the shadow of a hive ship eclipsed the sun. The caption simply read, "Still fighting." Somewhere beyond Octarius, the hive mind dreams. It does not sleep, but it dreams. It dreams of orcs, green, loud, unyielding. It dreams of their numbers, their regenerative flesh, their psychic roar. It dreams, and it understands. The orcs cannot be destroyed, but they can be consumed endlessly, without ever running out. And that, to the hive mind, is perfection. It does not see Kryptman's intervention as defeat. It sees it as opportunity, a test environment, a proving ground, a forge for new forms and new hungers. Leviathan waits, watching, learning. When it is ready, when the last lesson of Octarius is learned, it will rise again, and this time there will be no rivals left to feed its fire. And so the war goes on, every day, every night, every second. Orcs and Tyranids devouring, birthing, evolving. Planets stripped bare, then reborn as fungal jungles and chitin forests. Rivers of acid and blood running side by side. From the void, it looks like madness. From within, it feels like purpose. No diplomats, no treaties, no end. Just the sound of eternal war echoing across the stars. And perhaps in that sound, the galaxy hears its own heartbeat. In the halls of the Ordo Xenos, Kryptman's name is no longer spoken. In the Death Watch archives, Octarius has its own classification. Event Horizon. Meaning, no return, no contact, no rescue, no hope. But sometimes, very faintly, Auspex arrays pick up low-frequency transmissions drifting from that cursed sector. It is never words, only two sounds, a deep rolling roar, and beneath it the faint clicking of chitinous limbs. The War and the Devourer, still locked together, still learning, still feeding, and perhaps they will never stop, because some hungers are too perfect to end. When the galaxy tore itself in half, the hive mind did not blink. It cannot blink. The moment the Cicatrix Maledictum split the heavens, the stars themselves seemed to scream. To humanity, it was the end of history, an apocalypse measured not in fire but in distance. To the Tyranids, it was only weather. The Great Rift was born, a wound across reality, stretching from one side of the galaxy to the other, glowing like the exposed vein of a god. Where its tendrils reached, the warp became storm and shadow. Where it widened, whole sectors vanished into eternal night. For the Imperium, it was calamity. For the hive mind, it was opportunity. Across the stars, the Astronomican's light faltered. For 10,000 years, it had been the beacon that guided ships across the void, the Emperor's psychic flame burning eternal from the golden throne. But now, half the galaxy lay beyond its reach. The Imperium fractured into two broken empires, Imperium Sanctus, bathed in the Astronomican's faint light, and Imperium Nihilus cast into an endless night. Communication died, warp travel became madness. The armies of man fought blind, deaf, and alone. In that silence, something older and hungrier began to move. Before the Great Rift, the Tyranids had always carried their own darkness. The shadow in the warp, a psychic pall that smothered all other signals. Wherever the swarm advanced, astropaths screamed and died, unable to feel the Astronomican's light. Now, for the first time, the shadow met its equal. The psychic hurricane of the Great Rift crashed into the calm, predatory silence of the hive mind. And something strange happened. Instead of being crushed, the shadow bent and flowed. The hive mind learned the texture of the storm, the shape of the chaos. And it began to adapt. It learned to swim through turbulence, to feed upon the detritus of broken thoughts, the psychic screams of dying worlds, the echoes of demons devouring mortals. It learned that even madness could be sustenance. The Great Rift, for all its horror, became a feeding ground. In the years that followed the Rift's birth, Imperial savants began recording impossible phenomena. Tyrannid bioships emerging from warp storms that should have annihilated them. Splinter fleets appearing inside closed warp rifts without any trace of a jump. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggeration until the bodies began to appear. Creatures that bled not blood but raw warp energy, carapaces that shimmered with ghost light, synapse nodes that pulsed with miniature warp fluctuations as though alive in two realities at once. The Adeptus Mechanicus called them biodemoniforms. The Ordo Xenos named them warp eaters. The hive mind called them nothing at all. It simply made more. These creatures were born not of flesh alone but of psychic storm. Their instincts were tuned to chaos. They could ride the currents of the Great Rift the way a sea creature rides a tide. Where human ships were torn apart by the madness of the warp, the Tyranids drifted through it like spores on wind. And wherever they landed, new nightmares grew. In the Imperium Nihilus, light itself became a rumor. Without the Astronomican, travel was guesswork, communication impossible. A cry for help could take years to reach its destination, if it reached it at all. And so, when the Tyranids came, no one knew until it was already too late. Entire subsectors were consumed in silence. Administratum records simply showed names crossed out, coordinates redacted. Planets were listed as unreachable, lost to warp instability or non-compliant. But from orbit, the truth was visible. The gray, mottled scars of digestion pools, the shimmering trails of spores drifting in solar winds. Even the stars seemed dimmer there. The hive mind had found its perfect hunting ground, a galaxy half blind, half deaf, and fully divided. Leviathan had never been one thing. It was a pattern, a consciousness stretched across countless organisms, learning through division and reconnection. After Baal, after Octarius, it had scattered, broken into splinters, some crippled, some dormant. But now, in the chaos of the Great Rift, those splinters began to awaken. Each adapted to its environment, mutating into something new. Hive Fleets Behemoth, dwelling near the northern warp storms, evolved transparent hulls and stealth organisms, invisible even to augurs. Hive Fleet Oros in the galactic east developed thermal-resistant chitin, thriving near unstable stars and plasmatides. Hive Fleet Kronos near the edges of the rift learned to feed not only on life but on psychic energy itself, consuming demons, nullifying warp activity, and purging chaos wherever it spread. Each fleet carried a fragment of Leviathan's will, but all were connected by invisible threads, a network of instinct and purpose beyond language or distance. They did not compete. They did not cooperate. They simply were. And wherever they went, they brought silence. The Hive Fleet Kronos was the strangest of all. It first appeared in the southern regions of the rift, where demonic incursions were so constant that entire systems had been abandoned. Imperial forces had written these zones off as lost. But when scouts returned centuries later, they found the demons gone. The warp storms were quieter, and the only remaining life was Tyrannid. Kronos had done what the Imperium could not. It had eaten the warp itself. Its creatures exuded null fields that disrupted psychic phenomena. Its synapse nodes pulsed in patterns that mirrored Geller fields. It moved slowly, methodically, as though hunting something that could not die. And wherever it found demons, it devoured them. Not just their bodies, but their essence, the raw psychic energy that made them real. How it managed this, no one knows. Some Magos believe it had evolved organs capable of absorbing warp radiation. Others think the hive mind had discovered a way to anchor its consciousness in both realms. Either way, Kronos became the first fleet to turn chaos into nourishment. The Imperium called it a blasphemy. The hive mind called it progress. While the hive fleets evolved, humanity struggled to breathe. The Indomitus Crusade, launched by Roboute Guilliman himself, brought light to the dark for a time. New worlds were reclaimed, old ones fortified. But even the Crusade had limits. Every fleet sent to aid a besieged world risked becoming lost in the storms. Every communication delay meant millions dead before help could arrive. The Tyranids understood none of this, and that was their greatest strength. They did not care about communication. They did not need orders. They did not fear isolation. Every lost splinter was still part of the whole. Every adaptation was shared across the Gestalt. Where man saw division, the hive mind saw expansion. As the centuries turned, the Tyranids changed again. Their appetites grew more refined. No longer did they simply strip planets bare and move on. Now they studied their prey. Some splinters learned to consume slowly, preserving specific resources. Atmospheric composition, mineral density, population genetics. Others evolved to mimic human distress signals, luring rescue fleets into ambush. Entire systems became trap worlds, bait for the desperate. And in the darkness of the rift, the hive mind experimented with something new. Psychic resonance harvesting. It began targeting worlds with high emotional output, battlefields, shrine worlds, demonic fronts. It learned to feed on psychic emotion, faith, fear, rage. To the Tyranids, a dying world's collective scream was as nourishing as its flesh. The galaxy had become its choir, and the hive mind was learning the music. In the galactic east, something ancient stirred in response. Necron tomb worlds, long dormant, began to awaken in mass. Their machine minds detected anomalies. Biological networks exhibiting machine-like unity. The Tyranids had become a rival not of flesh, but of order. For the first time since the war in heaven, the Necrons saw something that mirrored their own perfection. A collective intelligence spanning light years, unstoppable and singular. Silent wars erupted beneath the surface of dying planets. Tyrannid bioconstructs and Necron constructs fought in shadowed catacombs beneath forgotten suns. Neither side spoke. Neither side prayed. When the battles ended, there was nothing left but dust and memory. But the hive mind learned even from them. It devoured Necron tissue, found it indigestible, and moved on, reshaping itself to bypass their metallic resilience. Soon after, new Tyrannid strains began secreting acids that could dissolve plasteel and living metal alike. Even the dead could not rest easy. In the millennia since the Great Rift's birth, the Tyranids have never stopped spreading. Even as humanity rebuilds, even as Guilliman wages his crusades, even as demons and Xenos tear at the galaxy's edges, the hive mind endures. It is patient. It is methodical. It never sleeps. For every world burned, 10 more are seeded. For every fleet destroyed, a dozen splinters feed unseen in the dark. The hive mind has no timeline, no borders, no ego. It simply exists as gravity exists, as hunger exists. It does not wish to rule. It does not seek vengeance. It only wants. And that is why it cannot be stopped. Among the scholars who dare study the Tyranids, a few have come to a conclusion both horrifying and beautiful, that the hive mind is not an invader. It is the universe remembering how to consume itself. All things in time are eaten by entropy. Stars collapse, galaxies fade, life devours life. The Tyranids are that truth made flesh, the final symmetry of existence. Creation feeding creation until nothing remains. And perhaps some whisper that is not evil. It is simply the end. Now the shadow in the warp stretches across half the galaxy. It is no longer confined to the hive fleets. It bleeds into the warp storms themselves, shaping their edges, muting their screams. Psychers speak of new dreams, not of demons, but of eyes. Cold, unblinking eyes watching from every star. They wake trembling, unable to say why they feel hunger. Some go mad. Others join cults that worship the Great Devourer, seeing in its purpose the only truth left. Everywhere the pattern repeats. Darkness falls, voices vanish, and silence spreads. Not the silence of peace, the silence of digestion. The Ordo Xenos, in its most secret conclaves, keeps a theory sealed behind 10 layers of clearance. It is called the Cryptman Hypothesis 2. It states that the Tyranids' arrival from beyond the galactic rim was not random, that perhaps they were drawn here. Drawn by the psychic noise of 10,000 years of war, by the birth of the Great Rift, by humanity's constant struggle, its emotional excess, its endless energy. Perhaps the galaxy itself summoned them, a fever dreaming of its own cure, and the Tyranids are that cure. Now, when astronomers look toward the edge of the galactic plane, they no longer see the black void they once called safety. They see movement, patterns of light that are not stars, new tendrils forming, stretching, curving back toward the center, a spiral of consumption closing upon itself. The galaxy, once vast, is becoming small. The Devourer, once distant, is becoming everywhere. And all the while, humanity prays to a dying god whose light no longer reaches half his realm. In the endless dark of Imperium Nihilus, there is a saying whispered by refugees. The stars are not gone. They are simply being eaten. It is not said with fear anymore, but with weary acceptance, because there is no running from hunger. The Great Rift divides the galaxy, but the hive mind unites it in a way no empire ever could. A single consciousness stretching across light years, indifferent to species, faith, or fate. And somewhere deep within that consciousness there flickers something almost like memory. The echo of all who have been devoured, all that has been lost. Perhaps in that vast ocean of thought there remains a trace of what it once consumed. A whisper of angels, a spark of humanity, a reflection of gods. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the hive mind is simply the universe doing what it was always meant to do, closing its mouth around itself. From far above the galactic plane where mortal eyes cannot see and time itself seems to drift like dust in the void, the Milky Way glows like an ancient wound. Half of it burns still, pale light flickering across the Imperium Sanctus. The other half lies drowned in the ink-black sea of the Cicatrix Maledictum. There is no clear edge between them, just a long, slow blur where light gives up. The galaxy turns, as it has for billions of years, but now it turns more quietly, more slowly, as if it too knows that something is ending. The Great Rift has made a scar across the heavens, a ribbon of eternal storm, and its shadow is alive. Within that shadow, old empires flicker like dying candles, and somewhere beneath the noise of war and prayer, something vast breathes in silence, the steady, patient rhythm of hunger. The Tyranids have no eyes to see this beauty, and yet they understand it better than anyone. Across the Imperium Nihilus, night no longer ends. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon that once made the void navigable, cannot pierce the rift's black heart. For those trapped beyond its light, every voyage is blind, every prayer unanswered. Every day measured by how long the sun still burns. On 1,000 worlds, people light candles not in worship but in memory, not of saints or soldiers but of starlight, because even starlight feels rare now. Astropathic choirs hum to themselves out of habit. The air in their vaults tastes of copper and old incense. They reach out with minds trained for communion and touch only static, the heavy, soft silence of the Tyrannid shadow. That silence has become the new weather of the galaxy. It rolls in slow waves, muting the psychic storms of the rift, whispering across sectors like the tide. In that quiet, even the most devout begin to wonder if the Emperor still hears them, or if the hive mind has already swallowed his voice. There are places in Imperium Nihilus where civilization persists through sheer refusal. Fortress worlds with lights that burn from generator banks older than their priests. Void stations where crews speak in whispers because sound feels dangerous. Shrine cities whose spires glow faintly like bones left under moonlight. They endure because that is what humans do, not out of hope, but because endurance has become faith. There are entire planets that no longer mark time by days or years, but by Tyrannid incursions. Their calendars are written in teeth and fire. Every month ends when the next feeding wave recedes. Every year begins when survivors crawl from bunkers to rebuild. To live in Nihilus is to live by candlelight inside the stomach of something that has already begun to swallow you. And yet, life goes on. Across the rift, Robut Guilliman carries a light that does not go out. He does not burn like his father did. His light is colder, deliberate, the light of reason, of memory turned into structure. He knows that faith cannot feed the hungry, cannot seal a hull breach, cannot resurrect a world already digested. But he also knows that without faith, humanity becomes machinery, and machinery cannot endure despair. So he walks between both truths. The Indomitus Crusade stretches thin across Nihilus. Its fleets appear like comets, brief, beautiful, then gone. They bring food, medicine, reinforcement, and leave behind stories. And sometimes, that is enough. In the absence of dawn, rumor becomes sunrise. To some, Guilliman is no longer the Primarch of old. He is simply the shape of hope, a reminder that the Imperium still remembers how to move forward, even when it cannot see where it's going. He fights wars not to win, but to continue. And in this age, continuation is victory. The hive mind does not care for politics or pride. It does not mourn the past, nor dream of the future. It exists only in the present, eternal, infinite, perfect. In the void between stars, Leviathan's splinters drift like patient hunters. They no longer move in great tides as Behemoth once did. They have learned subtlety. Some drift alongside asteroid belts, mimicking the cold reflections of mineral rock. Others burrow beneath planetary crusts and wait decades before rising. A few spread spores through the warp itself, letting storms carry them like pollen through the dark. In Nihilus, these splinters are everywhere and nowhere. Imperial scouts record entire systems going silent without battle, without flame, just gone. These are the silent harvests, worlds that vanish without sound. When exploratory fleets finally rediscover them, all that remains is the faintest residue of biomass, the molecular ghost of oceans, the impressions of cities pressed into dust. Even the air seems to have been consumed. The hive mind leaves nothing, not even memory. Beyond the rift, the galaxy still burns, Octarius still rages, a green and chitinous inferno that never ends. There, the orcs and Tyranids continue their eternal feast, each learning from the other. No Imperial commander dares to intervene now. Even observation ships return hollow-eyed, muttering about laughter echoing through the void. In other regions, chaos gnaws at the edges of reality. Warp storms carry demons that fall upon worlds already weakened by Tyrannid digestion. But there is less and less to eat, and the demons begin to starve. In the deep black, Necron tombs awaken. They do not rise in anger, but in curiosity. Cold logic studying the new ecosystem of entropy. Some even record the Tyranids as the final state of biology, and quietly retreat beneath the surface, waiting for silence. It is the strangest harmony, a galaxy of enemies slowly agreeing, through attrition and exhaustion, that perhaps the only way to win is to end. On a shrine world orbiting the dying star Yathar, the last congregation of the ecclesiarchy gathers every 7 days, though the planet no longer has days, only the dim red pulse of its collapsing sun. Their sermons are quiet. The choirs are small. Most of their hymns are whispers now. They do not pray for salvation. They pray for continuity. Priests preach to empty cathedrals where candles outnumber congregants. And yet, they still light each one carefully, murmuring, "Even a single spark remembers the flame." Chaplains on distant fortress worlds rewrite litanies into tactical orders. Because faith in this age must also load a bolter. And when they speak of the Emperor, they no longer describe him as light, but as gravity, he who holds us in orbit even when we cannot see the sun. This is not blind faith. It is weary, deliberate belief, a discipline against despair. And in the silence of Nihilus, discipline is holiness. Far from these shrines, in cold Mechanicus vaults lit by red lumen glow, the tech priests study the Tyranids not as monsters but as perfection. To them, the hive mind is the ultimate machine, a biological engine that self-repairs, self-replicates, self-improves. They whisper heresies into the static of their vox. Perhaps the Omnissiah speaks in flesh now. In the depths of Forge World Crastor, a Magos biologist has grown a creature from Tyrannid tissue and steel, grafted synaptic organs onto servitor skulls and watched them hum in perfect obedience. They call it the Sacroform. It is neither human nor Tyrannid, neither spirit nor machine. It is adaptation made visible. And in that experiment lies a terrible beauty. For perhaps the Mechanicus has realized what the Tyranids always knew, that purity is not survival, only change endures. Across the Imperium, rumors of machine organisms spread like wildfire. Some call them abominations, others call them the next stage of humanity. The hive mind does not care. It has already moved on. Pull back far enough and even apocalypse becomes pattern. From a cosmic height, the galaxy's wars look like the movements of slow fire across a field of ash. The Tyranids are the wind that stokes that fire. Invisible, impartial, endless. They do not hate, they do not love. They simply are. Every empire that has ever existed has called itself eternal. Everyone has burned. The hive mind will not last forever either. One day, perhaps, there will be no more stars to feed it. It will drift in silence, a sea of memory without matter. But until that day, it will keep feeding, keep adapting, keep perfecting. And in doing so, it will write the last chapter of life itself. Maybe when the last planet is gone and the last voice silenced, the hive mind will finally rest, not in victory but in completion. On the edge of the rift, in a place where the void hums with half-formed ghosts of light, there is a world called Lyrae Sigma. It is not important. It never was. A minor mining colony forgotten by the Administratum centuries ago. But it still has an astropathic choir, 6 souls bound by blood and vow to sing into the dark. For years they have received nothing, only static, only silence. And then one night, if such a word still means anything, the eldest of them feels a whisper through the shadow, not from Terra, not from any fleet or crusade, but from something closer, something human. He gathers the choir, they link hands, they burn the last of their incense, knowing it will not be replaced. And together they send a message, not coordinates, not distress, not orders, just a song. A lullaby once sung on old Earth, words forgotten by most, melody drifting through the void. We are still here. We remember the light, we will keep it until you return. The message travels for years, maybe decades, maybe forever. No one knows if it is ever received, but the act itself becomes legend. The last transmission of Lyrae Sigma, the final voice of man sent into the mouth of the endless dark. And so the galaxy turns, slower now, quieter. The stars bleed color into the void like bruises fading under skin. The Tyranids move unseen, consuming, becoming, dreaming. The Imperium endures, not triumphant, not righteous, but enduring all the same. Faith flickers, hope burns low, but neither goes out. The great rift still divides the heavens, but through its storms drift the remnants of songs and the faint shimmer of wings that might once have belonged to angels. Somewhere a hive ship drifts past a dead sun, its carapace reflecting the last light of that star. Somewhere a human child on a backwater moon looks up and mistakes the reflection for dawn, and perhaps that mistake is enough. Because even in the endless night, the stars remember being born. The galaxy sleeps now, in the hush between stars where hunger waits and memory lingers. You have walked through its ruins, heard its prayers, and felt the quiet heartbeat of a universe that refuses to die. If you wish to return, to dream again among these endless wars and ancient lights, stay with us. Let the story continue. Subscribe. Rest beneath the shadow once more. And together we will remember what it means to be small beneath an infinite sky.